A racist and corrupt police officer tried to intimidate a black woman inside a courtroom, but everything changed the moment he found out she was from the FBI. And what happened to him after that shocked everyone. It was supposed to be a routine trial. Another young black teenager facing serious charges he didn't deserve, another courtroom where power dynamics screamed louder than facts. Sitting quietly in the back, a well-dressed black woman observed everything. She wasn't loud. She didn't interrupt. But her eyes saw everything, especially the way that officer strutted around like the room belonged to him, like truth was his to bend. He looked at her and scoffed. "You lost, sweetheart. This ain't the waiting room for jury duty." She didn't flinch. But he stepped closer. "Or are you here for the defendant? One of his little cousins or something?" "Thought so." Then, louder, as if performing for everyone in the courtroom, "I'll always show up with your fake degrees and attitudes, thinking you matter here. You don't." Laughter from a few people in the back. Embarrassed silence from the rest. And she stood there. Calm. Silent. Her lips didn't tremble, but her heart did. Not from fear. From restraint. She had trained for years to stay calm under pressure, but not because of people like him. Because of people protected by people like him. He blocked her path. "I said you don't belong here. You people come in here thinking," but he didn't finish. Because that's when she pulled out her badge. Slowly. Quietly. With the kind of power that doesn't need shouting. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Internal Affairs. Field Supervisor. You could hear a pin drop. The color drained from his face. His voice broke before it even tried to defend itself. "Wait, what is this? What the hell is this?" She stared at him. Cold. Measured. "That's exactly what I came here to find out." But what no one in that courtroom knew, was that this moment wasn't a coincidence. She wanted him to humiliate her. She needed it. Because what came next would only make sense if the world saw him for who he truly was. She had been building this case for months. Quiet interviews. Confidential files. Surveillance footage. Victims too scared to speak, until they knew someone powerful enough was on their side. Every step he took thinking he was untouchable, she was right behind him, collecting evidence, building a case so airtight it would crush him in the same system he once used to crush others. And now, he was unraveling. It turned out he wasn't just a racist. He wasn't just corrupt. He was a predator with a badge, someone who had built a career on falsifying evidence, planting drugs, intimidating black families into silence, and bragging about how he could get away with anything. He never thought someone would come for him. Especially not someone like her. But now the media was watching. The courtroom had eyes. The public was listening. And the man who once took pleasure in throwing young black men behind bars, was about to find out what it felt like to be one of them. The trial turned. The judge, once quiet, leaned forward. The defense attorney, once uncertain, smiled. Witnesses began to speak. Former colleagues stepped forward. And the irony? The same prison where he sent dozens of innocent lives to rot, was now preparing a cell for him. But what really shattered him, what really broke him, wasn't the sentence. It wasn't the trial. It wasn't even the betrayal of his own department. It was what she whispered to him, just before he was escorted out in handcuffs, tears in his eyes and shame on his face. Justice doesn't always wear a robe. Sometimes, she wears heels. And as the doors closed behind him, you could still hear his voice begging, pleading. Not for forgiveness. But for protection. Because inside those prison walls, his name was already known. And not in a good way. Now the question is, what did she really do to take him down? What was the plan that led to this exact moment? And what secrets did she uncover that shook the entire justice system? Stay until the end, and you'll find out. To every black viewer watching this right now, we see you, we stand with you, and we support you. At Plow of Twist, we firmly reject all forms of racism, discrimination, and injustice. Your voice matters. Your story matters. And justice matters. Now, get ready for a powerful story that will shake your heart and open your eyes. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a twist like this one. Enjoy the story. Her name was Amara Johnson, and there were two things she had learned early in life. 1. Silence was often louder than shouting, and 2. Being underestimated could be the greatest weapon of all. She grew up on the south side of Richmond, Virginia, in a neighborhood where ambition often collided with survival. Her mother was a school teacher who worked double shifts and came home to grade papers at the kitchen table. Her father, a mechanic, taught her to recognize the sound of a good engine and the smell of a lie. They raised her to be patient, precise, and dangerous only when necessary. By the time she was 15, Amara had witnessed more injustice than most adults could stomach. Friends wrongly accused, teachers looking the other way, police treating her classmates like suspects instead of students. But Amara never let bitterness eat away at her. She studied, observed, memorized. She carried her rage like a secret knife, hidden but always sharpened. She would grow into it, wield it the right way when the time came. When others yelled, she listened. When they reacted, she calculated. Years later, that discipline earned her a seat at Quantico. And not just any seat. Amara had graduated at the top of her class, specializing in behavioral analysis and internal corruption. While most agents wanted field action or cyber forensics, Amara went after something dirtier, something that couldn't be tracked by data alone: abuse of power from within. She didn't want to chase criminals in alleyways. She wanted to expose them in courtrooms, in precincts, in places where they wore badges and smiled on press releases. By her mid-30s, Amara was a field supervisor in the FBI's Internal Affairs Division, and her transfer to Louisville, Kentucky was anything but random. It wasn't for a promotion or a new team. It was a mission she took personally. For months, her team had been quietly collecting complaints and sealed affidavits about a particular police officer, Detective Raymond Shaw. White, mid-40s, decorated, praised in public, feared in private. His record looked flawless. But behind closed doors, a very different man emerged. Anonymous tips spoke of intimidation tactics, manipulated reports, and repeated patterns of targeting young black men for stop-and-frisks that escalated into arrests with suspicious evidence. And yet, every internal investigation seemed to dissolve into nothing. Amara was assigned to find out why. Louisville was a city divided, not by geography, but by trust. There were neighborhoods that had stopped calling the police altogether, communities that held meetings not to discuss safety, but survival. The justice system wasn't just flawed, it was cracked open, and men like Shaw slipped through like oil through fingertips. His authority was nearly mythic in the West End precinct. He played the part of the dedicated officer well, always first to respond, always last to leave. But what set him apart was his ability to make people feel small, especially black folks who dared to ask questions. He spoke in sarcasm and stared through people instead of at them. And worst of all, he had allies. Quiet ones. Judges, prosecutors, even fellow officers who looked the other way or helped tidy up his messes. Amara had watched all of this from the shadows at first, reviewing body cam footage, interviewing suspended officers, visiting victims who had given up on justice years ago. She worked her case in silence, meticulously. But then came something that changed the pace, a case involving a 17-year-old boy named Caleb Montgomery. No priors, no gang ties, no history of violence. Arrested for possession with intent to distribute and resisting arrest. 2 officers involved. One of them, Shaw. The charges didn't make sense. Caleb was found with a small backpack and a few school supplies. The drugs were discovered in a hidden compartment in a locker at a gym he didn't belong to. And the resisting arrest charge? A shaky cell phone video showed Caleb face down on the pavement, not resisting at all. Something was off. Amara knew it. But what made her decide to finally step into the light wasn't just the case, it was the courtroom. She'd spent her whole life operating from the outside of these rooms. Sitting quietly, blending in, watching how people like Shaw twisted perception. She was done watching. The trial was set for early March. A packed courtroom. Community activists on one side. Detectives in uniform on the other. Cameras weren't allowed, but tension didn't need lenses to be visible. Amara entered in civilian clothes, deliberately. No badge. No blazer. No sign of her authority. Just presence. The kind that made some people nervous and others curious. She sat in the back, behind Caleb's mother, taking mental notes, watching Shaw pace near the front like he owned the place. It didn't take long for him to notice her. His eyes scanned the room, landing on her with something between suspicion and amusement. He walked over during a recess, casually, but with the arrogance of a man used to getting answers without asking. He leaned in close, his voice low but loud enough for others nearby to hear. He smiled, but it wasn't kindness. It was performance. You waiting for someone? Because this ain't open mic night. You can't just show up and play lawyer. Amara didn't respond. She just looked at him. No fear. No smile. He tilted his head. What's the matter, cat got your tongue? Or maybe you just thought this was one of those, we support our youth, type things. Listen, sweetheart, they don't need cheerleaders. They need accountability. That boy in there. He's a problem. Just like the others. People glanced over. Some stared. But no one interrupted. You know what the real problem is? Y'all come in here dressed up, thinking just because you speak nice and sit still, it makes you different. It don't. At the end of the day, you're just another, but he stopped himself. Not because he wanted to. Because her hand moved. Slowly. Deliberately. Pulling out a badge so crisp and golden it caught the light even in that dim hallway. FBI. Internal Affairs. You're under review. That was all she said. He blinked. Once. Twice. The blood drained from his face, and for the first time since she'd seen him, he looked smaller. Not weak. Just, exposed. But the real story didn't begin with that reveal. That was just the spark. The real story began years ago, with whispers. Complaints swept under the rug. Families told to move on. And men like Shaw building careers out of silence. Amara hadn't come to Louisville just to witness another injustice. She came to bury it. Over the next days, more was revealed, about him, about the people protecting him, and about what it really takes to dismantle a system that rewards cruelty. But for now, the courtroom grew colder. His confidence cracked. And everyone around began to wonder, who was this woman? And why did she look like she already knew the outcome of this trial? Because maybe, she did. And if she was right, he wouldn't be walking out of that courtroom. Not through the front doors. Not ever again. The courtroom returned to silence, but it was no longer the same silence that had filled it at the beginning of the trial. Now, it was loaded with a different kind of tension, thick, sharp, uneasy. People shifted in their seats not out of boredom, but because something had shifted in the air. That badge Amara revealed didn't just interrupt the flow of a trial, it disrupted the rhythm of a system that had learned to operate undisturbed. And though no one dared say it out loud, they all felt it, something was unraveling, and the thread had a name. Back at the prosecution's table, Detective Shaw kept glancing over his shoulder, as if trying to remind himself that he was still in control. But even his posture had changed. His jaw clenched more tightly, his breathing shallower, his arrogance faltering. He sat straighter, spoke less. The judge noticed. The defense attorney noticed. Amara noticed most of all. She didn't need to speak again. Her presence was a reminder that this trial wasn't what it seemed anymore. The rules had changed. Or maybe, for the first time, they were finally being followed. When court adjourned for the day, Shaw made his way toward her, slower this time, cautious. No crowd to play for now. No allies in earshot. Just the two of them. "You've made your point," he muttered under his breath, eyes darting around the hallway. "Whatever this is, whatever game you're playing, let it go. You don't know who you're messing with." Amara didn't blink. "That's where you're wrong. I know exactly who I'm dealing with. The question is, do you?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a threatening whisper. "If you think flashing a badge and playing hero makes you untouchable, think again. I've been doing this a long time. You want to poke around in shadows, be my guest. But don't expect to come out clean." Amara leaned in slightly, her voice smooth but anchored with something sharp. "I didn't come here to come out clean. I came here to drag you into the light." Shaw's face twitched, barely holding back a reaction, and then he turned and walked off, fast. But he felt it, that crawling fear behind his spine, the sense that this wasn't just some bureaucratic inconvenience. It was personal. The following week blurred into tense hearings, but outside the courtroom, Amara worked quietly and relentlessly. Her team, embedded in different corners of the city, was collecting testimony from those who had long been afraid to speak. One woman, an ex-dispatcher, broke into tears when asked about Shaw. She spoke of calls redirected, reports altered, evidence lost after night shifts. A former patrol partner admitted off-record that Shaw had once bragged about how easy it was to clean a scene when no one was watching. And then came the name that made everything crack wider, Terrence Willis. Terrence had been arrested 6 years prior, charged with assaulting an officer and possession. Served 4 years. But the arresting officer? Shaw. The supposed assault? A bruise that conveniently didn't show on any photos. The possession? One bag of cocaine found in a backpack Terrence swore wasn't his, and had never carried. Amara found him living in Indianapolis now, working night shifts at a factory. He was hesitant at first, quiet and defeated. But when she mentioned Shaw's name, his entire body stiffened. "You think you can actually get him?" he asked, not with hope, but disbelief. "I don't think," Amara replied. "I know." Back at the courthouse, the atmosphere was shifting. Public defenders whispered in corridors. Officers who once laughed loudly now avoided eye contact. And Shaw, he looked thinner. Not in body, but in presence. He avoided the press. His answers became shorter, more defensive. During one cross-examination, his voice cracked when challenged by a new piece of footage, one Amara's team had unearthed just days before, showing Caleb's arrest from a different angle, a hidden dash cam that had somehow never made it to the case file. The judge's face darkened. The room grew still. After that, the judge ordered a recess. Shaw stormed out, hands trembling, his collar damp with sweat. Outside the building, he found her again, Amara, standing near the courthouse steps, arms folded, eyes watching like the sky before a storm. He didn't speak. Not this time. His silence was louder than anything. Later that evening, back at her temporary field office, Amara laid out the new timeline with her team. They now had proof that Shaw had been involved in at least 5 questionable arrests, 3 of which involved minors. They had signed affidavits, audio clips, timestamps. But it still wasn't enough. Not for what she wanted. She didn't just want his badge revoked. She wanted to send him to the place he'd built a career weaponizing. She looked around the room, then at a sealed file sitting on the edge of the desk. "We need to bring in Leonard Price," she said. Price was Shaw's former partner, the only one who had requested a transfer after working with him for 6 months. Since then, he'd gone quiet, taken a desk job, refused all interviews. But Amara suspected he knew something no one else did. Maybe not what Shaw had done, but how he got away with it. She called him that night. He hung up. She called again. On the third call, he picked up, silent. "You were there," she said. "I know you saw things. I know you didn't speak. I also know what it's like to stay quiet because you're scared. But if you don't talk now, it'll follow you forever." He sighed, a long, tired breath. "You don't know what he's capable of." "Maybe not," Amara said. "But I know what I'm capable of." They met 2 nights later in a parking garage. His hands shook. He looked over his shoulder every few seconds. "He planted drugs," Price finally said. "He set people up. And we all let him. Because we thought he was cleaning up the streets. But he wasn't. He was building a resume off broken lives." "Why didn't you say anything?" Amara asked. Price laughed bitterly. "Because he made sure no one could. Every time someone got close, something went missing. Sometimes, someone got hurt." Amara handed him a recorder. "Then say it now." The next morning, Shaw arrived at court later than usual. His uniform looked sharper than ever, pressed and stiff. But his eyes were twitchy, his mouth tight. He walked like a man trying to hold a wall from crumbling behind him. He didn't see the new person seated in the gallery, Price, staring straight ahead. Nor did he notice the envelope that had just been handed to the judge, marked confidential, urgent. Inside that envelope was a transcript. A recording. A witness statement that would change everything. The judge cleared her throat. The courtroom hushed. "We have new material evidence submitted this morning by a federal investigation. Due to the gravity of its content, I'm calling for an evidentiary hearing before proceeding." Shaw froze. Outside, Amara stood by the glass windows, staring out at the cloudy sky, her phone buzzing with messages from the bureau confirming, the Department of Justice had now taken an interest in the case. But this wasn't over. Not yet. Because what no one knew, not even Shaw, was that the real bombshell hadn't dropped yet. That was coming next. And when it did, not even prison would feel like enough. The courthouse felt colder that morning. The air wasn't just still, it was dense, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. The judge had called for a closed evidentiary hearing. Only a limited number of people were allowed inside, but the tension had seeped through every hallway, every stairwell, every breathless conversation in the lobby. Reporters waited outside, pressing phones to glass. Officers whispered in corners, unsure whether to defend their brother in blue or step back and let the flames burn. Inside the room, Amara sat quietly, her hands folded on the table, eyes locked on the man across from her. Raymond Shaw. He looked different now. The lines in his face were deeper, like the stress had carved years into him overnight. His shoulders weren't pulled back in that arrogant square anymore, they drooped slightly, uncertain. The room was smaller than the courtroom, with no audience, no jury, just a judge, a few legal counsels, 2 federal agents, Amara, and Shaw. The silence was heavy, not dramatic, but unnerving in its truth. Here, no one could hide behind performance. The judge adjusted her glasses and nodded to Amara. She stood slowly, unhurried, like she wasn't just revealing something, but burying it. She reached for a small flash drive and slid it across the table to the clerk. No words, just a look. The screen lit up as the file opened. A voice filled the room. Leonard Price's voice. He spoke slowly, nervously, but clearly. Describing years of abuse. Watching Shaw manipulate scenes. Hearing him brag about it. He used to say he could plant evidence in a church and still walk out a hero, the recording said. And we let him. We all let him. The sound of shame in Price's voice wasn't just audible, it was palpable. Raymond Shaw flinched. His fingers gripped the edge of the table, nails pressing into the wood. Amara looked at him, calm. You told people you were cleaning up the city, she said, her voice low, not accusatory but precise. But you weren't. You were building your own little empire, brick by brick, on the backs of boys who never had a chance to speak. Shaw didn't look at her. I have names, she continued. People you locked up with nothing but your word and a planted bag. You broke families. You made mothers bury sons with court papers instead of caskets. And now, he cut her off, voice cracked and defensive. I did what I had to do. You don't know what it's like out there. Those kids weren't saints. Amara stepped forward, not loud, not theatrical, but close enough for him to feel every word. Neither were you. He shook his head. You think you're a hero? You think anyone's gonna care what some snitch said on tape? You think you've got enough to bring me down? Amara tilted her head slightly. Not just that tape. The judge raised a brow as Amara signaled to the agent beside her. A second flash drive was placed on the table. This time, the video came from inside a holding cell. The image showed Shaw pacing, unaware of the small camera tucked in the corner. He was on the phone. The call had been legally recorded as part of a separate federal investigation, but its relevance was now impossible to ignore. On the screen, Shaw's voice could be heard clearly. They're sniffing too close. I need you to get rid of that dash cam footage. You know the locker room files, erase the backup too. If they get that, it's over. The courtroom remained frozen. Shaw's mouth dropped, lips trembling. Amara folded her arms. You were sloppy, Ray, she said. You forgot that the walls talk when you think you're alone. His voice rose, desperate. You manipulated this. You trapped me. No, she said simply. You did that to yourself. I just held up the mirror. He stood up abruptly, his chair crashing behind him. You don't get it, he shouted, looking at the judge now. They needed someone to keep the streets clean. I was doing what no one else had the guts to do. The judge didn't blink. Shaw turned to Amara again, breathing heavily. You think locking me up makes a difference? You think any of this changes anything? You don't belong here. You never did. Amara stared at him, emotion flickering in her eyes, but not anger. Not triumph. Something heavier. I belong exactly where I am. And you? You're about to belong somewhere you never thought you'd see from the other side of the bars. The judge cleared her throat again, turning her gaze from Shaw to Amara. I've seen enough. We'll reconvene for sentencing. But in the meantime, Mr. Shaw, she didn't finish the sentence. 2 federal agents were already behind him. Wait, Shaw muttered, stumbling as the agents pulled his arms behind his back. Wait, I have rights, you had responsibilities, Amara interrupted. And you threw them away. As the handcuffs clicked shut, something shifted in the room. Not victory. Not celebration. Just silence. The kind that follows long-awaited justice. Amara didn't smile. She just watched. Not as a woman taking revenge, but as a woman witnessing the system finally work the way it should have all along. But it wasn't over. Because as they began to escort Shaw out of the room, one of the agents leaned down and whispered something. Shaw's face paled instantly. He stopped walking. What? He whispered. No. No, that's not, I can't go there. The agent didn't answer. He just nodded toward Amara. You can thank her for the placement. Shaw turned, panic written across every inch of his face. You can't do that. You can't send me there. Amara raised her chin slightly. I didn't send you anywhere, she said. You just finally ended up where you belong. The doors closed behind him. And what no one in that room could see, what no one knew yet, was that Shaw's prison assignment wasn't random. It was carefully chosen. It was the same facility where several of his victims had served time. A place where the stories of his cruelty had spread like wildfire. Now, he would walk those same halls. Live in those same cells. Face the same guards he once gave orders to. And when the inmates found out who had just been transferred in, that's when the real reckoning would begin. But that's not all Amara had planned. Because she wasn't just there to end one man's career. She was there to change the whole damn system. And the next name on her list? Already under investigation. The van ride to the correctional facility was long, silent, and suffocating. Shaw sat with his wrists cuffed tightly in front of him, the metal digging into his skin. The chill of the air conditioning couldn't mask the sweat that clung to the back of his neck. He had spent years watching others make this same ride, some trembling, some silent, most angry, but none had ever imagined a man like him would take this road in shackles. He tried to keep his breathing steady, tried to hold on to what little pride he thought he had left, but the weight pressing on his chest only grew heavier with every mile they traveled. He knew exactly where they were taking him. He had sent people there. People who never deserved it. People who would never forget. In her office, Amara sat at her desk, the soft hum of her computer screen casting a pale light over her face. Her expression was unreadable as she reviewed the final report. Everything was documented. The recordings, the testimonies, the forged documents, the false arrests. It was all there, officially sealed and ready for federal release. But she wasn't focused on the paperwork anymore. Her eyes lingered on one line in the file, the location of Shaw's prison assignment. She had made sure it went through. Every signature, every department head, every step had been double-checked. Not out of vengeance, but out of justice. The kind that had been denied to too many for too long. A knock broke the silence. It was Leonard Price. He entered slowly, hat in his hands, unsure whether to sit or stand. "I heard," he said quietly, avoiding eye contact. "They moved him. To Jefferson." Amara nodded, not taking her eyes off the screen. "That's where he belongs." Price sat down slowly, his shoulders hunched as if decades of guilt were finally pressing down on him. "I keep thinking about the things I saw," he said. "How I looked away. I could have stopped some of it. Maybe not all, but some." Amara turned to face him. Her voice was soft, but firm. "You're not the first man who stayed silent out of fear. But you may be one of the first to finally speak. That matters." He looked up at her, eyes glassy. "Does it?" She didn't hesitate. "It does to the families. It does to me." He swallowed hard, then looked away again. "Do you think they'll come after me? The others? The ones still inside the system?" Amara paused, then leaned forward. "They might. But if they do, they'll have to come through me first." Meanwhile, inside the prison intake block, Shaw sat in a holding room surrounded by guards who barely glanced at him. He had already felt the shift. No more deferential nods. No more protective silence. Now, he was just another number in the system. The officer processing him, an older black man with a hard stare, took extra time reading his file aloud, enunciating every detail with a tone that was anything but friendly. Shaw didn't speak. He knew better now. Every sound he made felt like weakness. As he was escorted through the cell block, the whispers started. "That's him, that's the cop, that's Raymond Shaw." He kept his head down, but it didn't help. Faces pressed against the bars. Smirks. Eyes narrowed in recognition. And some smiled. Not with joy. With knowing. With anticipation. He had walked those same hallways before, barking orders, dragging prisoners down them. Now, He was walking them with his hands bound. Back in the city, Amara attended a community meeting where Caleb Montgomery's mother was speaking for the first time. The room was packed, activists, neighbors, victims' families. Amara stood in the back, not to be recognized, but to witness the shift she had helped create. Mrs. Montgomery held a microphone tightly, her hands shaking as she spoke. "I spent months begging someone to listen," she said, her voice cracking. "I thought my son was gonna be buried behind bars. And then, she came. Quiet, strong. She didn't just listen. She believed me. And she fought." Amara looked away, swallowing hard. These weren't victories she celebrated. They were debts she felt responsible for paying, one case at a time. After the meeting, Mrs. Montgomery found her. "He's out," she said, a small smile breaking through the sadness on her face. "My son." They dropped everything. Amara nodded. "That's how it should have been from the beginning." Mrs. Montgomery touched her arm gently. "You didn't just save my son. You gave me back my voice." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Mrs. Montgomery asked, "What's next for you?" Amara took a breath. "There's more." Shaw wasn't the only one. The next morning, Shaw sat on the edge of his bunk, his eyes bloodshot. He hadn't slept. The sounds of the prison were different when you weren't on the outside of the bars. Every laugh was a threat. Every silence, a trap. He didn't eat. He didn't speak. He waited. It came sooner than he expected. During yard time, a group approached him. No words. Just stares. One of them, Terrence Willis, stood in front. The same young man whose arrest Shaw had orchestrated years before. Now older, hardened, eyes dark and empty. "You remember me?" Terrence asked. Shaw didn't answer. "You should." Still, Shaw said nothing. "You made sure I lost everything," Terrence said. "My scholarship. My mother. My time." Shaw looked at the ground. "I was doing my job." Terrence stepped closer, his voice low, deadly calm. "No. You were doing whatever the hell you wanted. And now you're gonna learn what it feels like." But then he stepped back. No punches. No threats. Just silence. That was worse. Later that night, as Shaw tried to fall asleep, he heard whispers through the walls. "Tomorrow they're gonna move him. You think he's gonna make it?" He turned to the wall, closing his eyes tight, but the darkness inside his head was louder than anything in the prison. The faces of the people he'd arrested. The mothers who cried. The boys who begged him not to ruin their lives. They all came back. Over and over. At her office, Amara opened a new file. Another officer. Another case. The system was deep, its roots tangled with silence and complicity. But she wasn't tired. Not yet. There was more work to do. And she would do it, one name at a time. She stared out the window, the city below bathed in gold from the setting sun. Somewhere in that maze of streets, people were finally starting to believe again. In justice. In accountability. In someone who wouldn't flinch when the truth got dangerous. She didn't need applause. She just needed results. And the next story? It was already unfolding. Raymond Shaw no longer walked with the same presence. Inside Jefferson Correctional, the former detective became something more fragile than the men he once hunted. He became forgotten. Not by the system, not by the law, but by the illusion of control he had wrapped himself in for over a decade. The title, the badge, the sharp suits, the courtroom swagger, none of it followed him past the gates. What he wore now was isolation, and it clung to him like humidity. At night, he kept to himself, back pressed to the wall, listening to the shuffles and whispers of men he once condemned. He rarely spoke. When he did, his voice carried none of the sharp edges it once had. And yet, silence didn't spare him. Every look, every gesture from the inmates around him was a quiet reminder that what he'd done couldn't be forgotten, even if no one said a word. There was no direct retaliation. Not yet. Not in the way he feared. But there were other punishments, quieter ones. Tray deliveries lost on purpose. Showers cut short. Yard time restricted without explanation. The guards didn't touch him, but they didn't protect him either. He existed in a liminal state between shame and paranoia, where the past echoed louder than the present. He tried writing a letter, to an old colleague, to a friend who once covered for him. But the pen shook in his hand, and the words never came out right. What could he say? That he was sorry? That he didn't know better? The ink bled through the page, like his denial bleeding through the truth. Amara, meanwhile, had shifted into a new rhythm. The trial was behind her, but the weight of it wasn't. There were follow-ups, media requests, internal evaluations. Her office buzzed with conversations about precedent, accountability, and systemic reform. But none of that moved her as much as the quiet moments, the voicemail left by a man who had spent 9 years in prison because of fabricated evidence, the letter from a high school teacher who thanked her for showing her students what courage could look like, the email from Caleb Montgomery's mother with a photo of her son back on the school debate team. Those were the pieces she held on to. Not as trophies, but as truths. Still, not everyone saw it that way. There were whispers within the bureau. Some questioned her methods. Some thought she had made an example out of Shaw too publicly. Others feared the precedent it might set. A few even hinted that Amara had taken it too far, that placing him in Jefferson was personal. And maybe, in some way, it was. But the line between justice and revenge is not always drawn in the sand. Sometimes, it's buried in the blood of what's already been lost. Amara understood that. She didn't deny it. But she also didn't regret it. Her supervisor called her in for a closed-door meeting. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "There's concern," he said flatly. "That the way this case was handled, while legally solid, might be seen as retaliatory." Amara didn't flinch. "If accountability feels like retaliation, that says more about the system than about me." He sighed. "No one's questioning the facts. But Jefferson? You do realize what that means for optics, right?" She leaned forward, voice steady. "He was sent to a maximum security facility because of the severity of his actions. Not because of who he used to be. And if that makes some people uncomfortable, they should ask themselves why they were comfortable when he was doing those things in uniform." The supervisor didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked at her for a long moment, the weight of her words settling into the room like dust. "You're not wrong," he finally said. "But you're shaking the ground. And not everyone is ready for that." "Then they should move," Amara replied. Outside the office, she walked the hallway with a calm expression, but her thoughts were still turbulent. It wasn't about optics. It was about memory. Systems built on silence didn't fall overnight. They cracked. Piece by piece. And sometimes, someone had to put their foot against the crack and push. That was her role. Not savior. Not martyr. Just pressure in the right place. At the same time, something unexpected began to stir within Shaw. After weeks of isolation, he requested to speak with a prison counselor. Not out of a sudden burst of guilt, but because the weight of what was unspoken had begun to rot inside him. He sat across from the counselor with arms crossed, jaw tight, but eyes unsure. It wasn't a confession he offered, it was a question. "Do you think people like me ever change?" The counselor didn't answer right away. Shaw's voice cracked. "I used to believe I was fixing things. Making the street safer. I told myself that so many times, it became true. Even when I was planting evidence, I convinced myself it was for the greater good. The counselor folded her hands. Maybe that's the problem. Believing that your good is the only one that matters. Shaw didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, it was quieter than before. I hear them. The ones I hurt. Not their voices. Their silence. He didn't say anything else that day. But the counselor noted something had shifted. Not redemption. Not clarity. But discomfort. And sometimes, discomfort is the beginning of a different kind of justice, the kind that doesn't show up in headlines. Amara, meanwhile, was preparing for her next move. A new investigation had opened. Different city. Different faces. But the same disease. A network of officers exchanging data illegally. She would go undercover again, this time deeper than before. Her superiors trusted her now, but trust always came with strings. And though her case against Shaw had proven her skill, it had also painted a target on her back. One evening, she returned to her apartment late. The city lights bled through the windows, casting soft reflections across the hardwood floors. She made tea. Sat in silence. And for the first time in weeks, allowed herself to breathe. She thought of her parents. Of her neighborhood in Richmond. Of her younger self, watching news reports of men like Shaw being praised on television. She thought of the day she got her badge, and how it didn't feel like power, it felt like responsibility. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize. He's requesting to see you. She stared at it, heart still, mind racing. Shaw. Why now? She didn't reply immediately. She placed the phone down, took a sip of tea, and stared out at the city again. Somewhere out there, a boy who could have been a headline was sleeping safely in his bed. Somewhere else, a woman was finally heard. And behind bars, a man was learning what silence really meant. Amara knew the visit would come with questions, questions she might not be ready to answer. But the decision would be hers. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to hear what a man like Shaw had to say when he had nothing left to hide behind. The story wasn't over. And neither was the reckoning. The prison walls absorbed sound in strange ways. Conversations echoed just enough to remind everyone of how little privacy existed within them, yet they muffled the weight of emotions that lingered in each room. When Amara stepped into the visiting area, escorted through the security layers with silent nods from the guards, the atmosphere pressed against her skin like humidity. She wasn't nervous. But her breath was slower. Controlled. Focused. She had agreed to this visit after a week of deliberation, knowing it would lead to nothing practical. But justice wasn't always measured by verdicts. Sometimes, it had to be heard in the silence between words. And sometimes, the guilty needed to speak aloud what they had spent years burying just to realize the damage they'd caused was never invisible to begin with. Shaw sat across from her at a bolted metal table, his wrists cuffed even inside the secured space. He looked thinner, but not just physically, his presence was smaller. His eyes no longer searched the room with that restless confidence. Instead, they settled on her like someone trying to read a language he didn't speak. She sat down without a word. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The air between them buzzed with unasked questions and things that couldn't be undone. Finally, it was Shaw who broke the silence. "I didn't expect you to come," he said, his voice low, almost gravelly, like it had carried too much weight lately. Amara didn't shift, didn't blink. "I didn't come for you. I came for the truth." He swallowed hard. "You already have the truth. You always did." She leaned forward, arms crossed loosely over the table. "No. I had the facts. That's not the same thing." Shaw looked down at the table, his jaw twitching. "Then what do you want from me?" "I want you to tell me why," she said. "Not the lies. Not the excuses. The real why. Because I need to hear it from you. Not for the record. Not for the system. For me. For everyone who can't sit in front of you like I can. He stared at her for a long moment, then exhaled deeply, eyes flickering with something unfamiliar, maybe shame, maybe regret. He looked older than his years now. Not because of the setting, but because of the weight of finally being seen. When I first joined the force, he began slowly, I thought I was gonna be a hero. I really believed that. I grew up around cops. My uncle wore the badge. My dad respected them more than anyone else. He used to say, the badge doesn't lie. But people do. So I made it my truth. I thought the job would fix things. He paused, glancing around the sterile room. But it didn't take long before I realized it wasn't about fixing. It was about controlling. Controlling neighborhoods. Controlling fear. Controlling stories. And when you figure that out, you either walk away or you learn to play the game. Amara's voice was cold but steady. You didn't play it. You rewrote the rules. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, he looked like a man drowning. Yeah. I did. At first, it felt like I was protecting something. Like if I locked up one more kid, one more dealer, maybe the city would finally feel safe. But it didn't. So I started bending things. Telling myself the ends justified the means. You know how easy it is to lie when you're already seen as the truth. She said nothing. Let the silence expand. I thought I was keeping order, he continued. But really, I was feeding something in me. That power, it's addictive. The silence when I walked into a room. The way judges believed me without question. The way other cops fell in line. It made me think I was untouchable. That I deserved it. Amara's expression didn't shift, but inside, her stomach turned. This wasn't a confession. It was a dissection. A slow peeling back of the layers of corruption that never felt like corruption to the ones holding the knife. And when the complaints started coming in, she asked. The testimonies, the lives you ruined. What did that feel like? He looked away. Collateral. That's what I told myself. That they were just names on paper. Bad apples. Wrong place, wrong time. Anything to avoid seeing them as people. She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping lower. But they were people. With families. Futures. You destroyed that. And you didn't just do it. You enjoyed it. Shaw didn't argue. His shoulders sank. I know. And now I live with that. Every damn day. Amara stared at him, searching for something, maybe sincerity, maybe an ounce of the man he might have been before he chose the path he did. But what she saw was something more complex. Not guilt. Not redemption. Just a man finally facing the truth in the mirror. And hating what stared back. You want to know the worst part? He asked quietly. It's not being here. It's knowing that I had the chance to be different. And I wasted it. I could have made real change. I had the power. And I used it to hurt people who looked at me with fear in their eyes and called it respect. Amara closed her eyes for a moment, as if absorbing the weight of those words. Then she stood. I didn't come here for closure, she said. I came to see if you were human. I think I got my answer. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. Do you think they'll ever forgive me? She looked back at him, gaze sharp. No, she said. But forgiveness isn't yours to ask for. It belongs to the people you silenced. If they ever find it in themselves, that's theirs. But you? You get to live with the echo. She walked out without another word, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. The guards followed her, silent and respectful, aware that something sacred had just happened between two people on opposite sides of justice. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. But when she stepped outside into the crisp air, she paused. Not because of doubt. Because of the clarity that came with finally confronting the face of a system she had fought for so long. She hadn't come for vengeance. She had come to see if truth, when stripped bare, still had weight. And it did. That night, Amara returned home to find a package at her door. No name. No return address. Inside was a thin folder. Case files. Another city. Another name. Another badge. Her heart tightened. The cycle wasn't over. Not yet. But she was ready. Because some people run from the fire. And others are built to walk through it. The air in Amara's apartment felt heavier that night. The quiet wasn't peaceful, it pulsed with tension, the kind that wrapped around her shoulders and settled in her chest like smoke after a fire. The folder still sat on her kitchen counter, unopened. The edges were worn, as if it had passed through too many hands before reaching hers. She didn't touch it yet. She walked slowly to the window, staring out over the city. Lights flickered across neighborhoods, traffic rolled in the distance, and somewhere down there were people just trying to breathe a little easier than they did yesterday. That's what she told herself this fight was for. But tonight, after the confrontation with Shaw, after watching a man crumble under the weight of the truth he once ran from, something in her shifted. Not her purpose, that remained, but the toll. She could feel it. The cracks forming behind the strength. The fatigue hidden in her composure. For every win, there was another folder. Another fight. Another ghost left behind. She finally opened the file. The name inside was Daniel Keller. Another decorated officer. Different state. Similar pattern. Civilian complaints, evidence tampering, 3 internal investigations, all dismissed. Amara scanned the details. The hair on her arms stood up. The language in the reports was familiar, too familiar. It mirrored Shaw's early files almost exactly. There was a rhythm to corruption, she was realizing. Like a code passed down in silence from one predator to another. She leaned over the counter, gripping the edges, jaw clenched. How many more? How deep did this run? Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Leonard Price. A single line, "He's asking for you again." She stared at the screen. She hadn't planned to return. She thought she had already taken everything she could from Shaw, his confession, his collapse, his regret. But something about the timing pulled at her. She picked up the phone and called him back. Did he say why? She asked. Price sounded uneasy. Not exactly. But he said it's about someone else. Said he needs to tell you before it's too late. Amara exhaled. She hated riddles. But she hated missed chances even more. The next morning, she was back in Jefferson. The guards were more familiar with her now. They nodded with quiet respect, understanding who she was and why she came. The counselor who escorted her this time didn't say much, just walked her through the familiar halls with the same solemn silence. Shaw was already seated at the same table as before, his hands folded, no cuffs this time, just eyes more hollow than before. I thought we were done, she said as she Saturday, I thought so too, he replied. But there's something I never said. Something I didn't know I was keeping until last night. She waited. He shifted uncomfortably. There's another one. Someone like me. Worse, maybe. But smarter. Knows how to keep clean. Amara narrowed her eyes. Who? He paused. Captain Mark Jessup. Baton Rouge. He trained me when I was a rookie. Taught me everything I know. But he took it further. He doesn't just manipulate evidence. He launders charges through informants. Gets community leaders on his payroll. Nobody touches him. He's like a ghost with a badge. She stared at him, stunned. Why are you telling me this now? Shaw looked down. Because he's the reason I became what I was. I thought I was copying the system. Turns out, I was copying him. I've been following the monster when I thought I was the system. Amara processed the name, already recalling whispers from her early days in internal affairs. Jessup was a name that came up in passing. Always with reverence. Always untouchable. She felt her pulse quicken. You have proof? She asked. Shaw nodded slowly. Old communications. Codes. Patterns. I didn't keep much, but what I did, it's hidden. I can tell you where. But only if you promise me one thing. Amara's jaw tightened. What? Don't let him die a hero. She didn't answer. Just nodded. When she left the prison, her thoughts raced. If what Shaw said was true, then Jessup was more than just another dirty cop, he was the architect of a culture. She could feel the weight of it before she even began the investigation. This wasn't just about Baton Rouge. It was about unraveling the roots of a sickness that had grown too many branches. She spent the next few days pulling what she could. Quiet calls to old contacts. Scrubbing federal archives for anomalies. She moved like a ghost through her own network, careful not to raise alarms. She couldn't afford for Jessup to see her coming. The deeper she dug, the more disturbing it became. Several officers under Jessup's command had checkered records. Court cases mysteriously dropped. Witnesses recanting statements out of nowhere. Reports filed and deleted within hours. It wasn't just corruption, it was orchestration. She sat at her desk one night, exhausted, surrounded by files and tabs. Her hands trembled slightly from too much coffee and too little sleep. She closed her eyes and remembered Shaw's voice, that defeated tone that sounded more like a warning than a confession. He's worse. That phrase echoed again and again. She didn't want to believe it, didn't want to believe there were people like that still untouched, but the evidence said otherwise. Her phone rang. It was Price again. You need to hear this, he said. I just got word Jessup might be testifying at a state hearing on reform next month. He's being framed as a model of leadership. Amara's chest tightened. They're going to make him a symbol, Price continued. If you don't move now, I know, she said. I'm on it. But the pressure was immense. If she went after Jessup and failed, she could lose everything, credibility, support, her badge. Worse, she could give him ammunition to discredit every case she'd ever touched. She walked through her apartment, pacing, thinking, weighing the risk. The moral dilemma wasn't about fear. It was about justice. Was it worth jeopardizing everything she'd built to take down one man if the system would still protect him in the end? She called her supervisor. I have a lead, she said. A big one. He listened carefully, then sighed. I've heard whispers about Jessup. But nothing solid. I have someone who can make it solid, she said. And I have access to the trail. He paused. Are you prepared for what happens if this doesn't go your way? She didn't hesitate. Yes. Then do it. But quietly. And no, we won't be able to shield you if it goes sideways. She hung up. Her decision was made. That night, she returned to her window, staring at the city again. But this time, she didn't feel alone. Somewhere in the prison, a broken man had finally pointed to the bigger monster. Somewhere in Louisiana, that monster was preparing to be celebrated. And somewhere in Amara's chest, fire stirred again. Justice was never about one name. It was about all of them. Amara moved through Baton Rouge like a shadow in daylight, silent, sharp, watching every angle, every pattern. Her investigation into Mark Jessup unfolded with terrifying precision. Everything Shaw had said lined up, but what she uncovered went deeper. Jessup wasn't just manipulating a system, he had built one within it. Community programs used as fronts, trusted figures acting as intermediaries, young officers trained not in law enforcement but in manipulation. His influence reached city leaders, court clerks, even church boards. It was a network rooted in fear, disguised as order. Amara knew there would be no room for error. She operated without backup, piecing together the case with the same care she once reserved for dismantling Raymond Shaw. Only now, she wasn't just after one man, she was aiming at a machine dressed in respectability. In the final days leading up to Jessup's scheduled testimony at the reform hearing, Amara secured the last piece of the puzzle, an audio recording from a former informant turned whistleblower. It confirmed Jessup's direct involvement in falsifying crime data, coordinating cover-ups, and orchestrating planted arrests on key community activists who opposed his leadership. With her evidence compiled, she requested an emergency session with the Federal Oversight Committee. She presented everything. No theatrics. Just facts, voices, and scars in the shape of redacted files. The fallout was immediate. The media exploded with headlines that shook the foundations of Baton Rouge's trust. Jessup, moments before stepping into a podium that would have elevated him to statewide praise, was met instead by federal marshals in the hallway. Handcuffed before the cameras he once courted. The image was poetic justice, his smirk gone, his suit limp, his empire crumbling as Amara stood in the background, watching it all unravel. There was no speech from her, no public recognition. Just the sound of the truth doing what it was meant to do, echoing where silence used to reign. Jessup faced multiple indictments: abuse of power, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to violate civil rights. But the most damning evidence came from within his own circle. Officers who once followed him began to turn. Some out of fear. Some out of guilt. Some simply because Amara had given them the space to speak for the first time without being silenced. The system hadn't changed overnight. But it bled now. And that meant it could be healed. Back at Jefferson Correctional, Raymond Shaw received the news through a worn-out radio in the common area. Inmates leaned in as the broadcast described Jessup's arrest, his charges, the shocking turn of events. Shaw sat still, eyes fixed on the floor, lips parted but unmoving. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. But something in him loosened. A chain he had worn for years, forged in loyalty and fear, finally cracked. He stood slowly, walked back to his cell, and for the first time since his transfer, he slept through the night. Leonard Price was reinstated quietly into a consulting position within the Bureau, not as a field agent, but as part of a task force focused on dismantling internal corruption. He and Amara met occasionally now, less like colleagues and more like people who shared something unspoken. He would often ask her if she thought they were making a real difference. Her answer never changed, one life at a time. Caleb Montgomery, now free and fully exonerated, began speaking at youth events, using his experience to reach others who felt unheard. He didn't talk about revenge. He talked about survival. About hope. About what it means to be seen by someone who refuses to look away. He credited Amara only once in public, during a panel discussion, saying, "She didn't just believe me. She proved me." That line would echo in the community long after the cameras stopped rolling. As for Amara, she was offered a promotion, director of a new division within the Bureau tasked with overseeing officer conduct and community oversight. She accepted, but only under one condition: full autonomy. She built a diverse team of investigators, many of them people of color, people from the communities that needed the most protection, people who had once been told they didn't belong in law enforcement. Together, they began rewriting what justice could look like from the inside out. One evening, after months of relentless work, she returned home to find a letter slipped beneath her door. No signature. Just 5 words in careful, faded handwriting: "You changed more than policy. She didn't know who sent it. Maybe one of the families. Maybe even someone from the inside. But she kept it tucked in her journal, a reminder that not all victories come with headlines or applause. Some come in silence. In peace. In knowing. And in the end, it wasn't about destroying men like Shaw or Jessup. It was about making sure they could no longer destroy anyone else. That was Amara's justice, not revenge, not power, but protection. Not just for the voiceless, but for the future. Now, to you listening, what does justice really look like to you? Is it a courtroom? A prison sentence? Or is it the quiet moment when someone who was once invisible finally gets to tell their story and be believed? Can we ever fix the systems we live in if we don't confront the people who benefit from them the most? And more importantly, if someone like Amara had given up, who would have paid the price? Tell us in the comments what part of this story struck you the hardest. Was it the fall of a corrupt man? The strength of a woman who refused to be silenced? Or the ripple effect of one person daring to say, enough? If this story moved you, made you think, or made you feel something deep inside, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Tales of Twist for more powerful narratives that challenge the way we see the world. Your voice matters. And we're here to make sure it's heard.